which is where I'm from. Two people from XBOSoft are on the webinar. On the left side of the screen is Amy. Amy will be handling the chat, so if you ask any questions, comments, she'll be handling those. And on the right side, the older guy, that's me. Two speakers. We have two great speakers. We have Clareice, who has over 30 years of experience in commercial and government contracting. Hey Clareice, great to have you here.
I'm happy to be here also.
Can you explain us a little bit how you got involved into IT contracting?
I started out many years ago working with federal government contracting, primarily in an IT environment, doing pre-award, working with contracting with actually the government and clients to produce statement of works, to write contracts, to monitor contracts. I've got a certification from the NCA, the National Contract Management Association, and I'm PMP certified also.
Okay, great. And Clyneice has over 20 years of experience in testing, QA, and process improvement, so she's one of us. Clyneice, great to have you here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Could you explain us something how you got of your experience with Agile and Agile testing in particular?
Yes, I've been doing software testing for years, and within the last 10 years I've been working in the consulting arena with Agile projects, either helping them to implement Agile or to help manage the testing or quality related to them. So I'm currently working on an Agile project right now that's a large-scale one for the federal government. And also I've got my PMP, and I'm also certified by the American Society for Quality as a certified quality manager.
Great. And I guess people already guessed you're related, right? The two of you.
Yes. We're actually twins.
Really? Super. I'm very much looking forward to hear you speak, but before we get started, I'll have a few words on housekeeping. Everyone except the speakers will be muted. We do encourage that you guys ask any questions that you have. Amy will be handling those. Please use the chat bar on the right side of your screen in the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll try to fit them in when appropriate. And otherwise, we have a separate Q&A session at the end. And you will receive information on a recording after the webinar. Short pitch for our next webinar, July 30, we're going to have a mobile testing tutorial with Jean and Harrison. It's going to be bring your own device. So we're going to execute some tests together. Also looking very much forward to that. Okay, I'll give the words to the sisters. Clareice, I believe you'll take over from here.
Yes. When we talk about our agenda today, we're looking at 4 key topics: outsourced testing concepts, contracts and testing, procuring Agile projects, and monitoring Agile testing. So when we talk about outsourcing a critical function, it's important that you understand that it's dependent upon someone else to meet the deadlines and potentially the quality that you need from a testing perspective. So we'll be addressing these best practices for developing a contract for an Agile team, and once you have that contract in place, some considerations for monitoring performance to ensure that you get exactly what you paid for. Next slide. Okay, what you see on the screen now is that we want you to look at outsourcing from the perspective of what's typically contracted from a testing perspective. So when we're talking about outsourcing testing, we're either looking at consulting services where you're looking at someone to typically augment your staff for a specific testing related activity like functional testing or performance testing or to do an assessment. In this area, you're responsible for managing the work. They're just providing additional skill set. The other 2 categories you see on the screen are a more broader perspective where typically either the service provider could be providing the total service or you all are sharing. So it's really important that you understand these differences. Clareice is going to talk more about this later on, but what we're looking at here is that from the quality assurance or quality management perspective, you can have a variety of contracts, but you're looking at things like having the service provider provide a service like provide risk-based testing, or maybe helping you to do your testing center of excellence. So regardless, when you start thinking about outsourcing testing, part of what you need to understand is what is it that you are looking for from this provider? Do you need to augment your staff? Or do you need them to provide strategic level guidance and implementation on some key areas like quality assurance or quality management? Next slide, please. As we're moving to that slide, one of the things we have found is that outsourcing testing has similar kinds of challenges that any other outsourced project has. But there are some specific things to testing, whether it's Agile testing or not. So let's talk a little bit about them. There is no single best practice or clear definition of what testing a piece of software means. So their options are numerous when you're talking about outsourcing, and each have their own benefits. In addition to the complexity of the different testing practices and the wide variety that we also have the complexity of the system under test. And so part of what you need to do is to understand these challenges and ensure that your contract has the right language and the right outcomes to assure that these challenges are not overset in terms of your ability to get your service done correctly. So we want to make sure that you consider things like, if you're doing test automation, have you defined whether or not automated tests are tracked? If you're testing offshore, are they tracking the defects there? Do they have to provide the details? So there's a lot of different things that need to be considered when you're looking at outsourcing testing. A lot of times your baselines are not aligned correctly. If the testing organization that's procuring the services aren't operating efficiently, they don't have a process for how they're going to test. Maybe they didn't include in the contract how they're going to monitor the risk or the performance of the product. So in general, the ability to be able to have clear definitions about what needs to be done, what kind of testing you're going to do, how you're going to collaborate, and ensuring that you know how to monitor your risk are the key things that you need to address. And the good news is that Clareice will be talking in a lot of detail about that as we move forward. Next slide. So when we're talking about, is there really a difference between outsourcing an Agile testing project and another testing project? And the answer is yes. So the challenges we just talked about, those challenges are there in addition to others. When we talked about the three categories of testing, outsourcing, staff augmentation, or quality assurance, you can still contract from that perspective, but the key differences that you have to consider is that typically when we're contracting on a non-Agile project, there are deliverables and milestones that are designed around the traditional software development lifecycle. And there's a lot of control in order to make sure that the vendor is doing what you need to do. They have to provide these key deliverables and milestones. That doesn't work in an Agile environment because you're doing an iterative development where design, development, testing, and deployment are done during sprints. The deliverable type basis of contracts we had before doesn't really work as well. So that contract that you put in place has to be different. And that's what Clareice is going to talk about for the rest of the presentation, is what are the things you need to consider to address these differences for the right kind of contract for Agile. Next slide.
Understanding the basic contradiction between Agile and contracting. In many outsourcing contracts, whether you're doing staff augmentation or you have an entire function or some portion of the development lifecycle, the buyer is usually exchanging a fee for the promise of some predefined outcomes that will drive their approach. Often they select the team, the resources, they'll manage and direct the resources on a day-to-day basis. And so this general approach for deliverables, processes, and communications and details are agreed to in advance by the buyer and the supplier by virtue of a contract. Now, if you're just doing staff augmentation, that's a game changer because even though the supplier is providing the people, they usually are not dictating the methodology that is being used. But when you get down to Agile, then you're looking at the fact that you have the basic contradiction where Agile is built on flexibility. Flexibility and collaboration are the two key components of the Agile framework. And so then you talk about a predefined deliverable, things that are agreed to in advance, and this is where you find the basic contradiction that you have to overcome in an Agile contract. You need to have an agreement in order to define a fair and professional relationship. But since by definition Agile means flexibility, and typically, let's be honest, contracts are not built for somebody to easily and quickly change the game plan. That's one of the reasons why you sign a contract, because you've inked in the details. So understanding this dichotomy is critical in order for you to design a contract approach that will allow you a contract that will not create additional problems for you and will allow you to work within the framework. Next slide. Now let's look at some the primary key factors or elements on how Agile will impact your contract. Issue number one, co-location. Particularly if you're looking at outsourcing on a global area, whether or not the teams are going to be co-located or not, you're going to have to deal with the issue of how do you get the collaboration if you decide not to co-locate. If you are co-located, where? Who's paying for it? You know, what are the space involvement? Those are decisions that are critical and should be addressed in the contract. Who has the decision-making authority on both the customer and on the contractor side? And how will those decisions impact the time frame? What's the level of customer participation? The key ingredient for Agile, again, is collaboration, which means that stakeholders are critical. And again, their responses should also be timely and should not affect the schedule. You can never avoid pricing concerns, whether or not the contract is Agile or not. But something you have to consider is whether or not you're going to have your cost estimated based on a plan that can be revised or renegotiated. Again, the basic premise of Agile is flexibility. So how do you price, forward price in such a manner that you allow yourself some room? One of the ways that people look at it is to do target costs as opposed to doing fixed price. And we'll discuss that a little bit later. What constitutes a change that's significant enough to affect pricing or the schedule? That's another issue that should be addressed in the contract. And the last issue to look at is, what does cross-functional team mean in terms of that contract when you're looking at your integrated teams? You have to ensure that all the essential work to getting a release out is accounted for. So again, you know, Clyneice was mentioning we're not dealing with the typical software development life cycle. So you have to incorporate your testing. You have to incorporate, you know, your development. You know, everything has to be included in that one sprint so that the life cycle is from cradle to grave in terms of getting the software out. Next slide. So what's the fix? We're going to talk about what are some ways that you can actually work around this this dichotomy we have here. The first and the major consideration I want you to take away is the issue of modular contracting. In order to do Agile effectively in a contract, the work has to be chopped up and developed into increments. Making the increments helps you provide flexibility. It gives you a lot of smaller acquisitions that are easier to manage individually. You're still able to address the complex IT objectives you have in it, and those smaller contracts will allow for the delivery, the implementation, and the testing of the workable solutions within each sprint. So you're talking about, 4, 5, 8, 10 separate little mini contracts.
And this is Clyneice. I'd like to give an example. I'm working on a contract now and one in the past where the Agile contract was done with the development team. And you'll often see that model. And so there was a separate contract for the Agile testing team that is going to be supporting this Agile development project. So you've got two separate contracts, and you may often see that in your environment also. So it's very careful, again, that the flexibility that Clareice is talking about needs to be aligned, that the testing contract for the Agile testers need to align with the development methodology that was defined for the software development Agile project, so that the right items are included from the tester perspective and the flexibility that allows the development team to maybe change their sprints from 2 weeks to 3 weeks and still not be out of alignment with the Agile testing contract.
Yeah, in a perfect world, there would be a single contract that would incorporate all of that into that one little contract for each sprint. But that is not the world we live in. We have numerous contractors, all with specific specialties. So not only are you dealing with the fact that you should have multiple contracts for each of the sprints so that you can actually manage that piece well, and if you have to make changes, you're not necessarily having to change your entire contract, but you also have to deal with the complexity of subcontractors' work actually also being folded into that actual sprint and accounting for that in contract language. Next slide. So what's an Agile contract going to look like? In Lean Software Development, a book by Mary Poppendieck of Cutter Consortium, she recommends, next slide. We have issues with moving to the next slide. Well, I'll go ahead and start talking about this. But we're looking at a framing contract. So looking at taking your contract and having two essential phases to the contract. One could be a basic consulting contract that basically lays out the business objectives that you want to achieve, together with some high-level idea of how the software is going to accomplish these objectives. And this will also include, at a high level, the time and resources the client is willing to commit. And so that's your basic consulting contract, and that would be phase one. The second phase will be multiple contracts, and these are a series of hopefully fixed price contracts, depending on the risk involved, where you are actually defining what to build, the time frames, and how much it would cost. So these are the sprints. These are the iterations. So the results is a contract formation type that actually consists of a basic framing contract that outlines this is the basic deal, has the terms and conditions that you've agreed to, the time frames, and again, depending on the level of risk and the level of information in terms of your costing, whether it's fixed price or not, but it's going to define the number of iterations and the time frame it's going to take you to actually move through the process here. And the goal is to get a contract that will provide enough formality to make the agreement safe for both the customer, and the client. For an example,
this is Clyneice. You could have a 2-year framing contract that laid out that within 2 years you want to have a large-scale system implemented. And in it you would have the high-level requirements process and all the other key elements that would need to be identified. The second phase, you could have your second phase done by release. Let's say you're planning to do 2-week sprints and release software every 6 weeks or 8 weeks. So the second phase would lay out that maybe you would do each contract separate piece on a release basis, but you want to still have that flexibility that Clareice was talking about in case you change your releases. The project I'm working on right now, we started out with 2-week sprints, releasing every 2 months, and now we're doing 2-week sprints and we're releasing every 6 weeks. Then we're trying to determine maybe we should go back to every 3-month release. So again, because you need that flexibility in the Agile contract, that second phase contract needs to be flexible enough to account for maybe the need to change your sprint/release schedule without having, again, to go back and renegotiate your contract.
Next slide. The key when you're formulating these contracts is to focus on what you know. When you take the contract a step further, you're basically focusing your efforts on the one thing you know up front are the objectives. You know what the client is looking for at the end game. That should be clear. So if you focus there, you come in with target costs, the target schedules, and again, these are going to be on a case-by-case basis, highly related to the level of risk, the complexity of the service. You know, Agile works really, really great in small, nimble organizations, and where the rubber meets the road is in the larger, more bureaucratic organizations, companies, and/or governments, and larger and much more highly complex systems. So again, with an idea of keeping a contract fair for both of them, you may be able to fix price some pieces of this. Some of it may be that you're estimating target costs and target schedule based on certain assumptions that will happen. So these are the things that you can put in place in a contract that will give you the flexibility, and not to say that you won't be renegotiating some pieces of it, but it will at least allow you to continue to work while you renegotiate anything that's critical, and it won't be a game changer at such a point that you actually have to stop the work.
And again, just to put it back in perspective in terms of a concrete example, so on one of the projects that I'm working on, we have the development contract for the sprint, and the target cost and high-level schedule has that by end of year 2, this system will be delivered, and they will be using the Agile methodology, and there's some high-level scheduling in that framing contract that Clareice talked about. And then there is specific cost associated with each one of the releases that are in separate little contractual vehicles. The testing side is a little bit different, because here the testing contract for the Agile project is asking for the testers to be able to support an Agile development methodology. They're asking them to be able to support and implement automated testing. There's information about the types of testing that needs to be done, the visibility into it, the participation in the sprint scrum sections. And so again, if you're in an environment where the development contract is separate and the testing one is separate, then you want to make sure, again, that alignment has to come in so that you don't have a contract that doesn't work hand in hand with the development.
For these contracts.
I'm going to probably ask a question. Part of the contract should include the definition and the roles and responsibilities of all the key stakeholders that are involved. Say, if there are multiple contractors, the client will have some roles, and so will the contractor. to a certain extent within Agile, those roles are predefined.
Was the question, Jan, what roles participate in developing the contract? Like, for instance, what testing team members or development team members would participate in developing the contract? Was that it? Or who would be executing?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Developing.
I recommend having integrated people develop contracts, particularly when you're developing the statement of work. So you're going to need to have a contracting acquisition person there. In general, that person is going to be doing sort of an oversight role to let you know when you're going outside the I guess the comfort level of the company in terms of risk. But you should have development people in, you should have testing people in, people that actually know the client, and it should be a collaborative effort in order to frame what this contract statement of work is going to look like.
Because you want to remember with the contracting is you want a win-win. You want the provider to be able to deliver what you're asking for, and the customer wants to get back. And so to do that, that integrated team is critical. For you to do a testing outsourced Agile contract and not have a test lead on that contracting team that understands testing and understanding testing in Agile would mean you're going to miss some key parameters that need to be covered within the contract. Same thing with the development side also. Did that answer your question?
Okay, that covers the questions. And yes. There were also requests for more examples if you have them.
Okay. Examples of how the teams, well, we've got some coming up for outcomes, and we have some also coming up for
some of the actual measures that you would actually see in a contract, some considerations. So let's move through the rest of the presentation and then see if we provide the kinds of examples you're looking for. If not, we can come back and add some more in.
Okay, great.
Okay. One of the key parameters for you to actually do a contract that's going to be focused on producing results, because that's what Agile does. It actually is giving you workable software as you go along. So you're looking at outcomes. And this is a way of looking at how to define work that's a little different from what most of us are used to. We're used to writing very prescriptive statements saying, we want you to do it in this way, in this manner, and not a focus on what do you want at the end. So the first step is to actually get on a path that says we are looking at actual outcomes. What is being asked for at the end of the day? You're going to have to determine some measures. How are you going to know where you are and whether or not it's what you're looking for? So you need to have measures. You need to have some idea of service levels, and you need to have some way of monitoring the methods and the outcomes both. So these four pieces are going to help frame what that statement of work will look like, and doing these correctly will lay the groundwork for you to be able to monitor and see whether or not you're delivering what you asked for. Next slide. Let's look at terminology. What do we mean by outcomes? This is the end result that you hope to achieve during the performance of the contract activity. Requirements should be expressed as outputs or outcomes and not as instructions on how to perform the work. This includes a close examination of the process, how things are going to be done, what are the essential inputs, what are the processes, what are the outputs. If you're asking what tasks must be performed to accomplish the desired outcome, then this step is basically your requirements gathering using a framework that will generate outcomes and standards and not a solution. Measurable outcomes and evaluations are essential for a successful project. So you need to develop appropriate outcomes and evaluation processes which require forethought, planning, and good project structure. They need to be qualitative and quantitative. What you're asking is what measures of quality, quantity, or timeliness are appropriate and reasonable for this particular outcome. You know, what's your tolerance or deviation, if any, from the standards? If we're talking about automated testing results, then, and you're looking at the number of defects, what's your tolerance level for number of defects? So those are the things you have to build in. If you're looking at service levels, which is measuring the performance of a system or requirement, you're going to look at those to try to determine what the percentage is of the level of service that should be achieved. And again, this is written in a qualitative manner as much as possible. Last and most critical, you need to look at the method of surveillance or measurement that's going to be used to determine whether or not the outcomes and the standards have been met. So depending on your situation, you either want to maximize or minimize outcomes. There are going to be side effects, whether intended or not, and whether they're beneficial or detrimental. But if you recognize in advance the importance of these side effects, you can try to design your performance measurement process to regularly measure them. So if you focus on outcomes, it will help you determine if the solution or the vendor's work is meeting your requirements. Next slide.
This is going to give you a chance to actually see a practical application of what Clareice was talking about in terms of measuring your outcomes. We haven't got to the slide yet. But as we get to it, I'll go ahead and get started on it. In general, when we're talking about outcomes, the question we have on the screen now is, what do you need to know? So you've got an Agile testing contract in place. And let's assume that it's not just staff augmentation, that this testing organization that you're contracting for is going to be leading the testing initiative. So there are two key areas that you need to know information about. If they're executing your testing on your Agile project, you need to know the quality of the product. So that is an outcome that is critical to you. You have to have release decision information or input into that. So the kinds of things that you would want to have as an outcome for your information from their testing results that provide you visibility into the quality of the product could be things like the number of defects, status on some quality target that you have organizationally, quality attributes that you expect them to test for that provide information about the quality of the product, maybe the density of the defects. So they need to provide this information from their testing that give you, the customer, the ability to have visibility into the quality of the product so you can help with your release decision input. The second thing that you need to know as the service customer is, has that vendor provided the quality of the service that you asked for in the contract? So you need to make sure that part of your outcome is that you need to know that they are providing the service that you asked for in terms of your Agile contract. So here we see measures related to measuring the quality of their service to you. How good is their defect detection? How effective are the test plans that they are executing on your behalf? How effective is the testing in general? You know, you're spending a lot of money for it. Are you getting good test effectiveness as a result of it? Are they able to meet their plan to schedule? So again, moving forward in terms of looking at your outcomes so that you can put in place the right contract to deliver what you need, the two key areas you want to look at from a testing perspective is information and measures related to the quality of the product and information and measures related to the quality of the service. Next slide. We're going to go to a little bit level of detail next and just talk a little bit about Agile testing well, actually measuring the supplier outcome. So we're going to give you some specific details, measures that you can look at. So when we talk about supplier measures, again, we're looking at measuring the supplier outcome that Clareice had talked about. Are we at the next slide yet? So when we talk about supplier metrics, we're going to be asking how good are they, again, at doing the job that you're paying them for. So we're going to have some samples of different kinds of measures that you can specifically include in your contract depending, again, on your goals and your outcome. So some product metrics that we will be looking at, again, would be program defect density, where we're looking at the number of defects compared to the length of the source code. We can be looking at defects, backlog of open defects, so that would be a measure of like the count of bugs over time, and that could be weighted. We could be looking at measures related to product quality over time. Okay, there we are. So these are some of the specific ones. On the left-hand side of the screen are the metrics that are specific to, again, measuring the supplier-related outcome. How good are they at delivering that testing? So how many tests are they attempted in a given time frame, the number of tests that have been passed by a given time frame, the number of bugs found by a given time frame, again, their test effectiveness ratio, the defect detection capability, again, are they writing tests that actually find defects versus are they writing and executing tests that are happy path testing? And the duration of the testing process. Is it meeting within the schedule time frames? We know Agile testing, the Agile projects are short in terms of sprint, and so is Agile testing. So meeting your testing schedule and getting that testing done effectively in that time frame is important. On the right hand, we see measures that are more specific to the product. So again, we're looking at they should be providing, or your contract should require that they provide information as a result of their testing about defects by category or severity, maybe product defect density related measures, again, backlog of open bugs, how many are left, product quality over time. If you're looking at 6-week releases, what's the product quality in release 1 versus release 2 relative to modules or components? Again, that defect detection capability goes both ways from a service perspective as well as a product perspective. And then there's a defect severity index that's looking at the severity of the defects that are remaining open at the release time. And again, it gives you some feel for product quality overall. So these are measures, specific measures that could be included in your contract that you want information about from the testing that they're doing from your product, as well as measures to show the effectiveness of the service that they are providing to you. Okay, next slide. We just have a real quick example. There are some specific Agile metrics that you may want to consider depending on the development team that's actually providing the development metrics. But I'll go ahead and talk about it until the slide shows up. But velocity is a very important measure that you see in a lot of Agile shops. And so we've got some velocity, see the burn down and burn up in terms of story points. So in terms of using it as a developer would use it to show the number of story points that are being developed and coded. From a testing perspective, you would be using the number of story points that have maybe successfully passed testing. So you want to look at story points versus testing to show burn up and burn down kind of velocity ratings so that you have some similar measures to what the development organization is doing. You may also want to do some metrics in terms of customer acceptance tests. Remember, Agile is very customer focused, so the number of tests across the dates of your sprint or the dates of your release. Green are the ones that are passing in this diagram. Red are the ones that haven't passed or haven't executed. So again, it gives you an idea in terms of progress. Also on the right-hand side, if you're having a lot of churn in your story points, and there's a lot of churn in terms of inability to get defects fixed, this kind of diagram helps you to see the impact that it's having on testing. Okay, so we're on to performance measurement framework.
Here's an example of a performance measurement framework that addresses 5 key components of a performance measurement system so that you focus on outcomes and results by different performance indicators. You can look at a project. You can look at indicators for process. You can actually, maybe the key focus is actually the product, whether or not you're monitoring the excellence of the deliverables that you're seeing. You can never eliminate the factor of people, so how well your supplier is managing the staff, the staff experience, their availability, their capability. When you have, particularly if you're doing offshore, those are some of the things you have to consider when you're looking at whether or not you've got 12-hour time difference. You know, what kind of availability are you looking for when you're looking at timelines like that? What this does is provides a collection of metrics that you can choose from multiple dimensions of a testing engagement. The metrics can be catered to a wide variety of projects, and it basically sets for you just a framework for you to decide for this particular contract or product what is key. And looking at one or two of these, you can determine what are the key frameworks and address your monitoring and your outcomes and your measures specifically to those, and these will give you a big picture idea of whether or not your contract is on target.
And just to give you a quick example, if you're looking at projects, let's say for instance on your Agile testing, you want the test to conclude in 2 weeks. They have 2 weeks for testing for every sprint, or 1 week of testing. So that could be a measure for the project. In terms of the process, how effective is their test planning? Some of the measures I just showed you before could be in there. So you're monitoring the effectiveness of the test planning, their scheduling, their test execution, their test reporting. The product one would be the defect product-related metrics in terms of quality of the product. So the number of defects that they supply you information about your product quality, as well as any contractual deliverables you expect them to do, like their test plans. Then the people, Clareice talked about. So that gives you some idea of how this framework works with the measures that we just talked about. Next slide.
We're going to talk at a very high level about quality service levels, and mainly because SLAs is such a big deal, period, in IT. And I'm not advocating that you actually need to put in SLAs, but at some level you do need to have an idea of the quality of the service level that is being provided. And so these are some basic ideas of major categories that you would look at. Again, timeliness of the service, accessibility and convenience, accuracy, staff availability. Customer service is always critical, whether or not the service is courteous. The adequacy of the information that's being provided. And when you look at the news medias for the last 6 months to a year and noted the number of, particularly in third world countries, the number of front page news where facilities burned down, or we've had issues with major American companies who are doing offshore work in facilities that things happen. So again, this is one of the considerations when you're building your contract. You may want to look at the condition and the safety of the facilities that are being used. And again, this is not, you may not include all of these in every contract, but this provides a framework in terms of some major areas that you can look at when you're trying to determine the quality of the service that you're actually getting.
So we've done our major presentation. We'd like to summarize before we go to open questions.
So next slide.
And we'll go ahead and start summarizing as we move forward. So when you're talking about contracting for Agile testing, The key point we want you to take away is that you need to consider what you are trying to achieve. What are the outcomes or objectives or goals that you desire this Agile testing team to deliver or accomplish for you? And once you have that clear, and then you can come up with the measures, the service level, the cost, and all those other contractual factors that will allow you to lay the groundwork for a really good contract. But
and you also have to make sure that the work needs to be broken into increments, because that is the basic foundation of Agile work, is that you're looking at sprints, you're doing it in increments. So look at logical places where you can separate out the work, and that will be the basis of how your contract is going to be aligned. We put in place an overarching contract for your basic terms and conditions, but lots of little mini contracts that are going to be developed based on logical ways of actually delivering the functionality that makes sense within the development background that you're dealing with.
And flexible enough that if the Agile team decides to make some changes in sprint and release cycles, that they are not hardcore defined within those increments.
And last but not least, you need to definitely look at, is this a staff augmentation process? Are you just getting bodies, in which case your contract is going to look different? Or are you actually contracting out the entire service itself? There's going to be the dependency on the measures and the metrics that you'll be using if based on staff augmentation, as opposed to the contractor owning an actual full service is distinctly different. So you need to know that who's the ownership by the outsourced team, and you should definitely have clearly defined roles and responsibilities for who is doing what: contractor, subcontractor, and or customer.
Okay, we're open for questions.
Okay, that was very interesting. I'm going to start with a question I have, if you don't mind. I was wondering, in your performance measures and outcomes, is there any way to get the users of the software involved, like quality and use, and measure that? Do you have experience with those parts?
Yes. The difficulty I found with the user metrics is that typically they need to be done either post-production, and we struggle with that. The current project I'm working on right now, we have users doing the customer acceptance, and so their data is involved in the regular product quality, because the users are actually doing the customer acceptance testing. So the customer acceptance measures that I showed here would apply in this case. If you don't have users doing the customer acceptance and they're not involved totally in the process, then you're going to have to do some post-production type measures, and they should be a part of the results. It gets a little tricky from a testing perspective, because once it goes to production, the test team is out, and then you're into DevOps.
And one thing to remember when you're doing the contract is that at least at the beginning, you can clearly know where those customers are, what the frequency, so you can predefine and actually have outcomes related to, whether or not, what level of test, acceptance testing they're doing, when is it occurring, how quickly is the feedback. Those things can be predefined in your contract, and again, you will be checking to see whether or not they're holding up to their part of the agreement, and because that input can derail your contract if they are not timely, if they're not doing their piece. So you do need to include the users in your definition of outcomes that you're expecting.
And for instance, the project I'm on working now, we're struggling with performance from a load and not availability, but load perspective. And so we are getting feedback from the customer, because again, the product is going every 6 weeks out to the customer. So we are getting requirements related to performance, but it's not so much the testing team as the development team. What the testing team is getting is that because we're not hitting the performance targets from a load perspective, they're having to change their performance testing strategy. And the good news is that because contractually performance testing was a specific item, within the testing contract for the Agile testers, then there's no differences. So they just have to adjust their performance testing because the performance results in the field are not meeting the needs, and so there's no contractual change at all. But you're right, you want to include those customer related measures from a product perspective in terms of acceptance.
Okay, very, very interesting. I don't want to keep the other people not asking their questions. We got another question from, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correct, Vaibhav, probably not. Vaibhav is interested in how to effectively manage two teams located at different locations, working on the same or multiple products.
And that's a really trick question, because I'm assuming that none of this was set up before you actually started the engagement. I think you're going to have to get one or two key people involved from both of those teams, come up with the common areas, build a schedule, build some kind of, if you have the expected outcomes and they're the same for both of the teams, what are the roles and responsibilities for both, and try to get those correlated in some manner and then agree. Because unfortunately you're agreeing this post-contract, and hopefully your collaboration is good enough. People both want this to work so that you can actually have someone who won't come in and sort of like jury rig the process. But whatever your issues are, bring the issues up, have people troubleshoot possible solutions, and then frame an agreement and say, this is how we're going to handle the fact that you're here and we're here. Maybe there's an overlap over a certain time period in the day when everybody is available. I'm not sure how you're doing the time frames for the sprint calls, the scrum calls.
And this is Clyneice, the current project I'm working on, we do have testing done by multiple teams in multiple locations actually across the United States. And so we do have standing scrum calls that the testers are required to participate in, and then there are standing testing meetings that are done. So again, I don't know contractually what you had in place, but that is part of what needs to be done, is that in addition to participating on the development scrum, the testing teams have to have some coordinated meetings to assure that their testing strategy is in alignment. So we require that test planning alignment discussions are done for each of the 2-week sprint in terms of strategy to ensure that each of the different teams have a common strategy that makes sense. And that if one team is testing one area, the other team can be testing something else, because we don't need overlap. We don't need the same ones doing the same thing. So the key thing is you have to have those Scrum-like short stand-up meetings for testing to coordinate across those teams in different locations.
Got a question from Frank, and he's wondering if this usually are cost reimbursement contracts.
A lot of the sprints are fixed priced, because usually they're a fixed duration. There's a fixed number of people that that will be engaged in it. So it's possible to have them fixed price, the sprints. If you use a framing contract, that usually definitely can be fixed price, because it's just basically going to be your project management team, your terms and conditions. So that could be fixed price. It's going to depend on the complexity of the software development cycle, and I guess the number of, like, the project that Clareice is working from is across it's a large government organization, and there are multiple sites. So that would be a hard one to fix price, because there's so many moving pieces and moving points in it. But so I think the risk factor is going to be based on size and complexity. But that cost reimbursement is not a have-to.
And because that is such a high risk.
But you have seen contracts with, sorry, go ahead.
But anyway, so because sometimes cost reimbursable contracts have high risk, a lot of the development projects really aren't doing cost reimbursable right now. So you see a fixed price contract as the mode that's most often seen now for even Agile as well as non-Agile projects.
And I think what's key to that is what drove cost plus contracts so much previously in development is the fact that they were large systems over long time periods, and it was too many. There was no easy way for you to actually go in and identify all the parameters. But when you're looking at much, much shorter time frames, those are easier to fix price.
So did we answer the question?
Kind of, yes. I think so.
Yeah,
I think there's time for one final question.
That you should use a cost reimbursable versus a fixed for Agile, or are we seeing, we are seeing fixed price as a prevalent model for Agile type contracts. That is the model we see most often now.
And would you advise cost reimbursements?
It's hard to make advice on that without looking at each. These are case-by-case basis. It's really going to come down to how complex the system is and how and what's the level of commitment that the parties are engaging in terms of the people, the availability of the people, the roles and responsibilities. I don't think it has to be cost plus.
Yeah.
But
because the large scale one I'm on is a 5-year Agile project, and it is fixed price by increment, and we fix the scope within that. So again, from the development perspective as well as the test team, the expectation is that you have the bodies that are capable of performing this iteration, and there's a certain cost for that iteration, and that's how it's done, and you fit the scope within it. That's where the flexibility Clareice was talking about coming in. So I think it's harder to get people to agree to do, the government to agree to do a cost reimbursable. Maybe in the commercial sector you might find people that are more willing, but that has a lot of risk associated with it.
Okay, we're almost hitting the hour, and I want to do one last question from Nancy, and she's curious for examples of contracts going wrong. If you can give a short example before we close.
I can give an example from the testing perspective. I worked on a project where we had an Agile outsourced testing team, and the contract was fixed in such a way that the reporting that the team did was not specific enough. And so they put in that they wanted daily Agile test reports. And so what they sent out are reports that have yesterday, like it closed the business at 7 o'clock. The report comes out that says, we tested, and these are the defects we found by this category. And each day they send that report. And the customer came back and said, this isn't really helping me, because if you notice, I didn't talk about that they summed up over the week or a number of defects to date. So each day, so in this particular instance, the customer is very frustrated because they want better product quality information, and they're not able to get it because their contract said to give a daily report of this type, and that's the report they're giving. So when they ask for a different kind of report, it's like, well, that's not really in our contract. So those are the kinds of things that I find that that you're not flexible enough, or you're not clear about what it is that you really want in terms of information. So a little bit more flexibility in the definition of their product quality reporting needs would have allowed them to be able to get better reports without having to fuss and fight with their vendor, which is what they're doing now.
And you also sometimes see issues in where relationships go wrong. A lot of them tied into people, that the expectation of the quality, the experience, the expertise of the people that you actually thought you were getting is not supplied. So that's probably one of the more common areas, is that, but again, if you make sure that you put in your contract a measure of that is one of the factors that you're looking at, is whether or not you're adhering to that. And it's not as much, we're moving away from a focus on whether or not you have this credential or whether or not you have 4-year degree, but basically the quality of the work that's been provided. You know, if they promise to do, you know, to be able to do this level of automated tests, these 5 different tests, and 3 of the people don't have any idea how to do it, then that's an issue. So, but I think a lot of it just comes down to one of the main issues is whether or not they're providing the right kind of people to do the job and to do it on time.
Okay, I think those are wise words to close out. We hit the hour. Clareice Clyneice, thank you very much. It was very interesting. This is a topic to my heart. It was great to have you here.
And if we have additional questions, I think you have our email addresses, so we can entertain any additional questions via email, you know, if there's anyone who's interested.
Yes, I'd like to thank the audience as well. If there's any other questions, please send them to us, and I'll forward them to the sisters. Thanks everyone, and I hope to see you soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.